Okay, finally made it through. A bit of technical difficulties getting online. So, hi everyone, welcome. I think this is the fourth history time, history questions and answers I have done. Um, so far, I'm managing to make it every week, and hopefully this will continue. Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. Now the kids have gone back to school, I have more time. I hope. I hope. Anyway, I hope people have been enjoying them. I know I have. Um, some housekeeping, some announcements before I start. Uh, this day week, I'll actually be doing a live stream with Mehofen Clans and Dynasties, Irish Medieval History, and the Creative Condesa, I think, a discussion about Irish clans in the 15th and 16th centuries. It'll be 10 p.m. Irish time, so hopefully it'll be a good discussion. So it'll be four of us having discussion, so it sounds fun. So I may not do a history time question and answers next week. I'll see. I will have another video coming out probably over the weekend. It's about the question of the myth, really, of Irish slavery. I have I have the audio recorded. I'm just trying to decide on the format. I may film myself speaking because normally I go somewhere and film, whereas this is about a myth. It's about something that doesn't actually exist. Spoiler. So it's hard to film. So I may just film myself here in my office. Let's see. I'm still thinking about it. Be something experimental. It may just be a rant, but it helped get it off my chest. Okay. There's a bit of sun tonight, which is nice because it's been very, very wet here in Valencia. There was an article in the Irish Times today, I presume other papers, saying that this was the hottest summer ever. It didn't feel like it because it was wet. It was a funny summer. It was very warm and very wet. So let's start with the questions. If anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to ask now or submit one on my YouTube page or elsewhere, any of my socials. Sort of the more questions I get, the better, and actually the easier it is for me because I went rounding up some questions, looking in people who'd asked me over the last months, or I see in Facebook sites, etc. So let's start. The first question is quite a topical one. It's about the impact of Daniel O'Connell. Like I live down in Valencia in South Kerry. The house where Daniel O'Connell was born is about half an hour's drive from me. And Derrynan House, where he moved to and lived in, is about 45 minutes drive from me. And I know them both well. So Daniel O'Connell is someone who has had an impact where I live. But what about all of Ireland? What about in history? It was his 250th anniversary of his birth over the weekend. And I know the Taoiseach was down in Derrynan. It was the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. And then about a month ago, they had big celebrations in Carsavine, which I missed most of because I was away. But so, what was his impact? Basically, you could almost sum it up in the Irish democratic tradition. He's a very interesting person in that he's from a Gaelic minor noble family. I'm not even sure if he called them nobles. If you know this area, there is Ballycarbery Castle, which is in Valencia Harbour. It used to be referred to as Valencia Castle because overlooking the harbour. It was one of the main castles of McCarthy Moore, the McCarthy Moors, and the O'Connells were the stewards of that castle, the consuls of that castle. So their job was to mind the castle for the O'Connells. After the 17th century, Like the McCarthy Moors were gone. I think one or two McCarthys may have survived. Loads of poorer McCarthy survived, but not the top ones. The O'Connells kind of scattered over the bottom of Iveragh Peninsula. Um, Daniel O'Connell was born in Carron House, which is just outside Carsavine, as I said. They were not very wealthy, but not poor. If you see the house today, it's complete ruin, but he was. It was a substantial house. O'Connell himself, very interestingly, was for the first couple of years he was fostered basically up the mountains, a few kilometers away from where his parents were. It was a very traditional thing, was kind of following the the traditions of the Gaelic elite, whereby children be fostered with other families to create links, to create patronage, etc. So this happened with O'Connell, but then he was adopted as such. He came under the wing of his uncle. His uncle Hunting Cap was very, very rich. He was rich through smuggling, essentially. And if you drive through South Kerry from Waterville over the mountains down to Cardanio and then to Derrynan House, you can, and if you stop the car in the mountains and have a look over Derrynan, the bay or the bays, all the inlets, you can see easily why he made a lot of money from smuggling. It was very easy to smuggle in stuff. Now, Hunting Cap, whose one of whose sisters was the lady who wrote, the poet who wrote Cuina Artuleri, a very strong, wonderful, and beautiful poem about the killing of her husband. But Hunting Cap's idea was to keep your head down. They were very isolated because the Ring of Kerry Road had not been built then. It would only be built in the 1820s. So basically, his idea was we're Catholics. We keep our head down. We rely on Protestant friends to dribble the law so we don't lose our land. O'Connell received some education in France. Apparently, he saw the beginning of the French Revolution. Then he received more in England. He became a lawyer, and a good lawyer. But he didn't follow his uncle's path. He began to speak out. Thanks for the questions, B. Maxi. I'll come back to that now. Just let me talk, I'd say, for another 5-10 minutes about O'Connell, and I'll come to your question. So O'Connell decided to follow another path. He became a barrister, began to make a name. He was interested in politics, especially at first to Catholic emancipation. And the means he chose, and I presume other people helped him, but the means they developed to pursue this through the Catholic Association, whereby everybody paid a small amount, it began to get a huge mass involved in politics in a democratic way. And he repeated this later in the repeal campaign. Everyone would pay a penny a month, I think it was. It wasn't a large amount of money, but so many people paid it that they could do a lot. So he helped create one of the first mass movements in Western Europe, and probably the first mass popular movement in Britain or Ireland. So he helped engender a tradition in Ireland of getting involved in politics, of people who at that stage didn't have the right to vote. I think the huge mass of Catholics would only get the right to vote, of poor people rather than Catholics. The poor would only get the right to vote 50, 60, 70 years later. I can't remember the exact dates of when the right to vote was gradually spread. I know it was only 1918 that women were allowed, most women voted. So during the 19th century, there would be an expansion of the electorate. But O'Connell, very early on, he created this big movement, which most of them wouldn't vote in that stage. In fact, a lot of the voting was public, so landlords could control it. And there's stories here, for example, in Valencia, the they didn't want to vote the way the landlord wanted them to. Um, and in fact, I think the parish priest was supporting the landlord. So they decided not to vote, and they had to go by boat to vote, but they waylaid the boat. So he got this big mass working in politics, and that he was did this for 30 years or something, probably more. Catholic emancipation was achieved in 29. O'Connell died 20 years later. He had his monster meetings in between. So he, this creation of a big mass, a big group of the public people, the poor people, getting involved in politics, in democratic politics, and expanding democracy was very important. Um, Second, he became Lord Mayor of Dublin. Well, we'd say that's interesting, but he was the first Catholic Lord Mayor of Dublin since 1690, which is quite interesting. And in fact, there was probably no Catholic Lord Mayors of Dublin between Henry VIII, when he became Protestant, and uh, James II. So there would have been a long tradition of Protestants becoming Lord Mayor, and for O'Connell to break this was quite interesting. Third, to me, is quite important, is he was very strongly against slavery. He became friends with Frederick Douglass. And in this, he's quite a contrast with people like John Mitchell and other young Irelanders who, like Mitchell, in my mind, was terrible. He was very pro-slavery. Some of the other young Irelanders weren't, but they didn't want to antagonize Americans. They didn't want to lose support from America. Whereas O'Connell was open about it. He said he didn't want blood money. So he was willing to risk antagonizing Americans because of his opposition to slavery, which I think was something important. I think that Irish nationalists could have learned more about this. Um, Another impact that people often are critical of him is related to the Irish language. He would have known Irish. In fact, I think when he was brought up the mountains in Kerry for his first 2 or 3 years, where he's fostered, he would have been in a pure Irish speaking environment. However, many people criticize him for not doing more to support Irish. I think this is an area that needs to be examined a lot more. Um, was O'Connell anti-Irish language? I don't think so, but he was. He did have. He mixed in a lot of the top ranks of society because of who he was, Lord Mayor of Dublin. He spent a lot of because of a barrister. So he moved between Irish speakers and English speakers. But you could also argue that he may not have expected Irish to disappear because, like, Kerry would have been Irish speaking. In fact, I remember looking at my great grandparents' entry in the census of 1901, 1911. They were living in Killorglin and they spoke Irish and English. So Killorglin at that stage, 100 years later, or say 60 years after the death of O'Connell, was still an Irish speaking region. My mother went to school in Glenbeigh in the 1940s. It was still a Gaeltacht. So long after independence, the Irish speaking areas were much bigger. Um, they disappeared very quickly. Not very quickly. After independence, something happened with Irish speaking. Um, I think it's something that has to be examined much more. I think O'Connell could have done more to support Irish. However, it's easy to criticize him over that. But just to sum up, um, he had a huge impact. To me, that comes down essentially to his creation of and his teaching in a way, he's showing Irish people that you could use mass democratic politics. Now, let's turn to the second question here. Um, do you think the Battle of Ventry could be an account of the Romans attempting to invade Ireland? That is an interesting question. Um, the Battle of Ventry, it's a very interesting story. Just let me go through it quickly. In fact, I'm almost looking at Ventry out my window at the moment. I'm on Valentia Island on the north side, and I can see the Great Blasket in Inishvicallawn and the end of the Dingle Peninsula, Slea Head. And I have a feeling if I moved a couple of meters to the right, I could actually see the entrance to Ventry Harbour. So basically, in this story, the idea is that the king of the world, whose name I can't remember now, but I'm fairly sure in the story, it's in Irish, decided to come and conquer Ireland. In part, I think, because someone had been a member of the Fianna had been exiled. I think it was a fight over a woman, but he was exiled, and he convinced the king of the world to come to Ireland. And the king of the world basically got the king of France and loads of other kings, some from Middle East, etc., to come with him. And this Irish or Fianna exile guided them. The first place they landed at was the Skelligs, and the king of the world was all annoyed. He kind of said to the other Irish guy, "Oh, why did you bring us here? There's no beach here. There's nothing here." The Skellig is one big rock. And the Irish guy says, "No, don't worry. We still a few more miles to go." And then they sailed into Ventry Harbour. So obviously, whoever wrote it was well used to, who knew the area. Fionn McCool's stories, many people associate them, say, with Dublin and places like that, like Howth. Howth in Dublin is associated with them, Tara, etc. But so is South Kerry. If I did Toriacht Dermot August Grania for the Leaving Cert, and Dermot, the lover of Grania, he is actually from South Kerry. At least people down here say it. Then near Glenbeigh, there's a mountain called Seafionn. Seafionn Mountain. Seafionn Mountain is the seat of Fionn. A few, say 10 kilometers away from that, there is an Ogham stone. And under that Ogham stone is either the dog of St. Finian or one of the dogs of Fionn McCool. Fionn McCool is supposed to have been up there, and looking down, who did he see but Dermot and Grania? And I remember learning this in school with a Christian brother, and he skipped over this part very quickly because basically it said this was the first time that Dermot made Grania a woman. So they've been running around Ireland being chased by Fionn McCool for quite a while. So therefore, the first time they, had time to be intimate was somewhere near Seafionn, in a cave, apparently, in South Kerry. And if you want to avoid the Ring of Kerry from Glenbeigh or Killorglin and come to this part of Kerry, you follow what's called the Ballach. The Ballach is short for Ballach Usheen, the pass of Usheen. It's had that name for years. It's basically the path Usheen followed when he was going hunting and when he was going to meet Niamh. And where did he meet Niamh? Rossbeigh Beach, which is near Glenbeigh. So this area of Kerry is very associated with the Fenian stories. And until probably the 9th century, at the moment, the name for the Dingle Peninsula is Corcadivna. But the kingdom of Corcadivna was, I've said this before, these two peninsulas of Kerry, Dingle and Iverahawk and Corcadivna, and then what's called Mid Kerry, sort of Milltown, Keogh, Castlemaine. That was the kingdom. So they were two united. So whoever wrote this story knew the area very well. So basically, the king of the world, he lands in Ventry Harbour. And Ventry Harbour is huge. In World War One and before, a large amount of British ships used to shelter in there. There's pictures of some of the armored, one of the not of the British fleets, or part of it. Several, I think, a couple of battleships and stuff like that. It's a big deep-water harbor, and it's a very long beach, so it's an obvious landing place. So the king of the world landed there, and some of the local people called for help, and the Fianna arrived, Fianna arrived, and so too did some of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were friends with the Fianna. In the story, it's funny, they're just treated as an ordinary people, so they came along for a while, they fought the invaders and delayed them till the Fianna could get here. And then there's a series of combats for a long, long time. Finally, after loads of people on both sides die, the king of the world is defeated and he heads off. So, do I think that the Battle of Ventry is an account of Romans attempting to invade Ireland? I don't, for one reason in particular. The Romans wouldn't come here. It's unlikely that they would come here. Especially, hi Dennis, and hi Kevin. Actually, scratch that. Like, if the Romans coming from England, from Britain, Britannia, as would have been obvious, they would have landed somewhere on the East Coast. I know in North County Dublin there is a site that's been excavated, and many people claim that it is a Roman military base, though it appears to be more of a trading post, have been a trading post. So there were connections. But if the Romans were going to invade, they sent an invasion fleet, would they have come to Kerry? In part from the Roman geographical perspective on where Ireland was, that actually makes sense because they thought Ireland was in the Bay of Biscay. But, and yes, it probably was possible for them to send ships from Gaul, from Hispania to Ireland. They probably would have made it in a couple of weeks. On the other hand, it would make much more sense for them to do the obvious thing, attack from Britannia. I'm sure if they tried to send a fleet from Hispania, probably from where Lisbon is now, because it's the obvious big port on that side, on the Atlantic side of that peninsula. They would have come for a shock. It would have taken them a long, long time to reach here. So I think rather than being anything historical, it was somebody having fun. It is a very, very interesting story. I don't think there's anything historical behind it. And like, we don't know when it was written. But it would probably have been quite a bit after, say, the downfall of Rome, because Patrick, I think, is 432, so the 5th century, and shortly after that, the Romans had left Britain. So that's my view of that. But if I could just alter it slightly, it's interesting in that, if you know the Book of Invasions, the beginning of the Book of Invasions, especially to do with Amergin and the Song of Amergin, the Milesians, the sons of Mil, they landed near here. In nowadays, the Kenmare Bay, or which was the Earl of Kenmare, renamed the Kenmare River so he wouldn't have to pay some sort of tax or to stop other people. I'm not sure the true story. Kenmare, that inlet is referred to as Inver Skeina, the Bay of Skeina. Skeina was the wife of Emergan, the leader of the Milesians, and she died in. She was one of those who died when the Milesians arrived. However, there's a writer down here, Paddy Bush, and like he's very strong Irish, so he knows these stories very, very well. And he argues very convincingly, saying that Inver Skeina is actually Balnaskellig's Bay. And I agree with him in part because he shows that there are a series of, for example, in front of Waterville, which is right in the middle of the bay, there's rocks, which until now is called Carrick Aina, the rocks of Aina. Aina was one of the sons of Mill. Just past Waterville, there's this magnificent stone row called Ictakua, and it's there that Skeina is actually said to be buried. Skeina, the wife of Emergan. There's another stone row on the other side of the bay. Another Milesian is supposed to be buried there. Just outside Waterville, there's a ruined wedge tomb. Another one is supposed to be buried there. So all around the bay, there are ancient monuments associated with the Milesians. So I think he was actually correct. So I just find it interesting that we have these two stories associated with the sea, with invasions of Ireland, and they're both down here in Kerry. That's quite interesting. Hi, Aina Leonard. Nice to have you watching. And I think actually Irish history neglects the sea. I know that years and years ago I went to visit the National Maritime Museum in Dún Laoghaire. It was very interesting. I presume it's still going. It is still open. But there was a historian associated with that, John de Courcy Ireland. He constantly pushed the importance of Irish maritime history. And I just find it funny, for example, St. Patrick. Thank you very much, Leonard. Thank you very much. I'm glad you liked the videos. The story of how St. Patrick came to Ireland. He was captured by Irish raiders in Britannia and brought on Irish ships to Ireland, and then escapes on other ships. And then if you look, for example, stories of Niall hostages, etc., he's invading, raiding Britannia, Gaul, etc. And then these ships somehow disappear. The next ships that you come across in Irish history are from the Vikings, the Norse, and then the Normans. Jump forward a little bit, in the north of Ireland, you have the galleys crossing the North Channel between Scotland and Ulster. And then if you cross round to Mayo, you have, I think it's the O'Flahertys and the O'Malleys are associated with galleys. And I know in the 9 Years' War, for example, O'Connor Carey, he would receive supplies and men brought by some O'Malleys down the west coast into the Shannon, and then to Carrigafoyle, where his castle was. But apart from that, the naval aspect disappears from Ireland. What happened to the Irish seafaring tradition? We were an island. Everybody who came to live here came, or the ancestors at least, they came by boat. The Milesians, if it's the story of the Book of Invasions, the story of people arriving by sea. And then suddenly this seafaring tradition disappears. I find that funny. And perhaps, the story of the arrival of the Milesians, the Battle of Entry, are they linking back to something like that? I don't know, but it's very interesting. Kevin, you asked about the Bedell Bible and its use after Vatican II. Now, that is something I do not know much about. I went to Catholic school all my life, but I do not know much about the Bible. The Bible. Let me just check something about that, and especially modern Catholicism. Just 1 second. Okay, that's the first Protestant Bible. I tell you what, leave that with me, and I will come back to that. It's something I'll have to read up about. I'm not I'm not an expert in theology at all, but I will look it up, Kevin, and come back to that. Okay, so anyone who has any questions, please feel free to ask. And then my next question, people often ask me directly, or I see people asking, what's your favorite megalithic monument? Like in Ireland, we are blessed with the amount of megalithic monuments. The first one, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes, like is Newgrange as well as Nowton Doubt, the big wedge, not the big wedge tombs, the big passage tombs. They're amazing. They're amazing. They're amazing. But like we have portal tombs, wedge tombs, like so many stone circles and standing stones. Personally, I have a couple of favorites. They're both near enough to me. The first is the Stone Row in Ictukua, which is in Waterville. If you're driving through Waterville heading towards Derrynane, look to your left and you'll see these 5 big stones. They look from one direction to the sea and the other direction to Lough Corrán. They're beautiful, and they're very different in that there was a circular ditch built around them, unlike most stone rows, etc. down here. So they're quite special. And after that, there is a small stone circle it's in the Kerry part of Beara called Urragh, Uragh. It's actually facing Loch Inchiquin, and I actually do not know why that lake has that name, because Inchiquin is associated with the O'Briens in Thomond in Clare. Why the name was given there, and I think it's a recent addition. I really don't know. But if you ever get a chance to go to Urragh, do it. Like Ictukua is relatively easy to get to. It's actually on private land, so you should ask, but it's easy enough to visit because it's just outside Waterville. Urragh, you go to Kenmare and turn down to heading towards Castletownbere or someone like that. But then you have to turn off the main road. You go up this tiny road. It gets very, very, very tiny. And then you'll see a signpost and you park, and then you can walk. I went there on a dry day in October, but it had been raining constantly for the week before. So in the distance, there's a waterfall. This waterfall was huge, so it looked really, really special. And it's a beautiful place. Those are 2 of my favorite megalithic monuments. And I just throw in something else. Favorite castle. I'm sorry if anyone listening or afterwards you want to tell me any favorites, because there are many megalithic places I haven't visited. I want to go up to Tyrone. I think it'll be a more. I've only seen pictures, but that's on my bucket list of places to see, as well as some of the passage tombs up in the Dublin Wicklow Mountains. I've tried to visit them, and whenever I go up, it pours rain. At the beginning of August, I managed to get to Seafin, another Seafin mountain. It was a lovely warm day until we started climbing up this mountain. The path is very overgrown, but basically as soon as we got to the top and found this passage tomb, it poured rain. Like I had to take off my glasses, I couldn't see anything, but it looks very, very nice. So if anyone has any megalithic monuments they are especially attached to, let me know. What about favorite castle? So I'm just going to turn on a light. It's getting dark. Or does that make it weird? Sorry. No, I think I'll just leave the lights off. Okay, I'll leave this one on. What about a favorite castle? My favorite down here is probably Carrigafoyle Castle. In that it's still, although it was battered and brought under a big siege on a couple of occasions, it's still, you can still get to the very top. It's beautiful. It overlooks the Shannon. Um, sorry, I'm just going to turn on the light on top because I can't see my face. Yeah, I think that's better. So Carrigafoyle Castle, it's in North Kerry on the Shannon. I really, really, recommend that for a visit. I was at hi, the Rock of Dunamaze recently. I love that. I've been in Trim before. I've been in Carlingford. Lots of small little castles. There's one in Cork, Carrigadrihid, that I would really love to visit. It's on my bucket list. So, and about 30 years ago, I visited I the one in Antrim, on the coast. I can't remember what it's called now, but it the one where the kitchen is said to have fallen. It's a very, very nice one. Now, I talked about Newgrange. A question that I find very interesting is why, whenever people are talking about Newgrange, why do people always say it's older than Stonehenge, it's older than the pyramids? It's like, it's. I saw someone asking this question. I've been thinking about it, and I actually don't really know the answer. Because it's a comparison that, especially with the pyramids, it doesn't make any sense. Um, the civilization, the Egyptian civilization, is older, um, but it's a very different one. The culture who built Newgrange, they built something amazing. Stonehenge, I've never visited it, but the more I read about it, the more amazing I think it is. The pyramids are amazing. It's three different cultures, three different amazing things, and they're all very, very, very old. Why do we need to justify Newgrange? Why does it matter if it's, I don't know, 500 years older than Stonehenge and older than a few hundred years older than some of the pyramids? That shouldn't matter. Newgrange, Nout, Doubt, and all the other impressive passage tombs, and indeed stone circles, stone rows, some standing stones, they're all impressive in their own right. Why do we need to justify them by saying they're older than something else? They're all old. They're all um, 3, 4, 5,000 years old. Why is it that we need to justify them by their age? It's something I find interesting. I don't know, is it due to nationalism, patriotism, some sort of competition? Um, Maybe because Stonehenge and the pyramids are some of the most famous ancient things in the world. Maybe Irish people think that by saying Newgrange is older, it makes it more important. Um, I don't really know, but it's an interesting question. If you have any views, please feel free to say them. Okay, now I want to go on to a couple of what if questions. First of all, which is probably the most important what if question in Irish history or modern history, what would have happened if O'Neill had won at Kinsale? What do you think would have happened if he had won the Battle of Kinsale, or at least not lost? Because in my opinion, the Battle of Kinsale is such a missed opportunity. O'Neill and the Spaniards would have won by doing nothing. O'Neill, O'Donnell, they didn't want to fight. They knew they didn't have to fight. It was winter. Everybody was suffering. But the Spaniards, at least, they were inside Kinsale, in houses. Yes, they were being shelled, but they had quite a bit of food. And from Spanish records, we can see that they actually had quite a lot of supplies because when they returned home, they returned with a lot of supplies. Um, O'Neill and them were supplying them with beef, with live cows. Despite being the siege, they were managing to smuggle them in, so they weren't starving. The English were caught between the Spaniards and the Irish. They could be supplied by sea, but like the weather was very bad, so supplying by sea was getting very very hard. They were freezing. They were suffering dramatically from the weather. Probably 6,000 of them died in the siege. Um, a huge amount of English soldiers, when they came to Ireland, died very quickly. In until the discovery of penicillin, antibiotics, etc., most casualties in war didn't come from the battlefield. They came afterwards or during the campaign. Um, for example, the Spanish army in the Netherlands when they were fighting the Dutch, I think it had a rate of 4 or 5% of it would lose every month, even among garrison troops who were well supplied, etc. 4 to 5% of its men, people would die or maybe desert. The English in Ireland, in normal conditions, had a higher one. In Kinsale, they were dropping dead, they were freezing to death. The Irish knew that they didn't have to do anything. Simply by remaining where they were, the English would have either been forced to attack them or to withdraw. If they'd attacked them, the Irish could have simply avoided them because the English horse, for example, the cavalry, were getting more and more worn out. If they had been forced to advance to the Irish several kilometers, probably a lot of the horse would have been no use. An attack probably would have failed. So Mountjoy, if De l'Aquila had been patient at all, Mountjoy would more than likely have been forced to withdraw to Cork. If that had happened, he would have even after the battle was fought either Christmas, like I think New Year's Eve, or slightly after, depending on which calendar you're counting. So yeah, it happened at the beginning of January. Mountjoy was only able to take the field again, and same with Carew 5 months later. That's how badly affected the English were. Even after winning the battle, they couldn't take the field again. And after the battle, if the Spanish had just stayed in Kinsale, refused to surrender, or even if they had just kept the various castles they had along the west of Cork, the English would have found it very hard to take them. So if Mountjoy had been forced to withdraw from Kinsale, he would have lost a huge amount of his men in this withdrawal, desertion, sickness, getting harassed by the Irish. Probably a lot of more people would have turned to supporting the Irish and the Spanish. O'Neill and the Spaniards may even have captured Cork, though in a way that would have been irrelevant because what mattered to O'Neill, to win the war, he had to be alive and have his confederacy strong and intact when Elizabeth died. 1602, just after battle, Elizabeth was in bad health. The question was, how long could she live? If Mountjoy had been forced to withdraw, you would have been left with O'Neill would have been very successful. A lot of what Mountjoy had won back, say in the Midlands, the borderlands, between Leinster and Ulster would have been won back. The English obviously would have had to send another body of men, more reinforcements, more a fleet, etc. That would have taken time to do. So more than likely, even without any other fighting, any other major battle, when Elizabeth dies and James assumes, there would have been a truce because the Spanish and English, apart from Elizabeth, didn't want to fight each other. Elizabeth didn't want to make a truce because she wanted to say she didn't want to lose face, etc. So there would have been a truce. When James did come to power, there was a treaty in London signed by the English and the Spaniards. And in this treaty, the Spaniards, more or less, you could say, they abandoned the Irish because one of the things in the treaty was they weren't going to interfere with each other. But if you had a strong Catholic force, O'Neill's Catholic Confederacy in Ireland, James would probably have been forced to get this armistice with the English to grant some sort of toleration, at the very least, of Catholicism. O'Neill and probably, say, even Butler or some of the other old English lords would have been granted some sort of role in the state. And most important, you would not have had the flight of the Earls. The Gaelic nobility wouldn't have been so decimated. There would have been no flight of the Earls, no plantation. The history of the Irish state, the formation of the Irish state would have followed a completely different path. And like, what would Ireland be like now? I'd say it'd be very, very different. Just in relation to that, I saw someone arguing the other night about the O'Briens, saying the O'Briens, because they were descended from Brian Boru, were the best and they never did anything wrong. Whereas someone said, "Oh, but they fought with the English in the battle of Kinsale," which is true. I think it's funny because, like, Brian Boru, say, in the historiography of the 19th, early 20th century, he was so bigged up, shall we say, by nationalist historians. People overlooked the role of the O'Briens in the 16th century, especially Donogh O'Brien, the Earl of Thomond. Donogh O'Brien was, although he was Gaelic, he was raised in England. He was Protestant, quite Protestant it looks. He became very, very anglicized. And he was very important for Elizabeth in the 9 Years' War. Like, he fought at the Battle of Kinsale. I know one of his brothers or half brothers joined O'Neill's Confederacy, but Donogh O'Brien, the pro-English one, managed to get rid of him very quickly. So, and then his family became English in all but name. The opposite, shall we say, of the traditional trajectory of the Normans who came to Ireland, the Old English. The O'Briens became essentially English. They civilized themselves, shall we say. There was Murder of the Burnings, I think it was, was it the 1690s or the 1640s? And I know the O'Briens were on the Cromwellian side, mostly. Then, like, recently had Lord Inchiquin, who I think spoke with a good English accent. So it's funny, the O'Briens were seen by some as being, an Irish clan, etc., whereas most of them were essentially part of the English aristocracy in Ireland. It's an interesting thing, an interesting question. Now, a final question. Again, it's what if? What would have happened if there had been no civil war? Again, I think it's a very important question, one that's hard to tease out Um, but I think the effects of the Civil War on, for example, the Irish language, the Boundary Commission, in a way, we could say the morale of Ireland afterwards were dramatic. If you think of Ireland in the last decade, in the 1890s, you have this great fervor of what they call it, the Celtic revival, the Gaelic revival, and in the beginning of the 20th century, people are turning back to Irish. The Gaelic League is set up, the GAA is set up, though that was before. But you have this great movements. Okay, you have the campaign for home rule, which never quite gets there, but gets loads of people involved. Parnell. Um, you have throughout the 19th century a rediscovery of Irish history, a problematic one, but it was still important. Um, before, if you look at Irish history, look at those who were involved in the War of Independence or in 1916. So many of them, like Pierce, were involved in the Irish language movement. I know in my family, my my father's family were raised in Irish. They were in Dublin. They were raised in Irish for the first couple of years. So you just great attachment to the Irish language. But after independence, the retreat of Irish continues, and this fervor associated with the Irish language disappears. Again, this is something I think needs loads more research. I hear people talking about, oh, we lost Irish because of the English. No, we a substantial part of the Irish population was Irish speaking in 1922. A much less proportion is Irish speaking in 2025. We, the Irish people, bear responsibility for this, not the English. What happened? And I think what happened was the Civil War. It broke something. I know my grandfather and his sister were both involved in the War of Independence. My grandfather went on the pro-treaty side. His sister went on the anti-treaty side. Um, and they both were involved in Dublin. And I find this funny. They would both come home from the fighting in Dublin for lunch or for dinner. It was very Irish, and mine wasn't the only family that was cut across by this political divide. Um, so it, and I think, whereas if there hadn't been a civil war, there would have been a greater pride in having achieved independence in the Irish language. More could have been achieved. We wouldn't have been left with what, in a way, was a very, very conservative new state that didn't seem to have much of a vision. Even, for example, in 1932, when De Valera came in and started changing stuff. Um, a second thing is, what would have happened to Northern Ireland if there had been no civil war? Collins was sending guns to the north, and from what I've read, most of the IRA in the six counties, or a large amount of them, were pro-treaty. Um, Collins was trying to stir up something there. It's very hard to find out exactly what he was doing because it was done in secret. Um, but the Civil War takes away from that. It also has to be remembered that the Civil War wasn't particularly over Northern Ireland. The oath and the non-achievement of the Republic and some other events were more important. I think everybody presumed that with the Boundary Commission, there would have, like, at least two of the counties would have been returned, and then the North would have somehow or other just collapsed. Um, and that's another thing that would have happened. What would have happened with the Boundary Commission if there hadn't been a civil war? The Civil War removes Collins, Griffith, and some others. And then, like when was the Boundary Commission? 1924, 1925, like De Valera, Lamas, all the other ones who had been against the treaty, they were not part of the political scenario at the time. So the Boundary Commission, the Free State government was very naive in it. They expected major things. They got taken advantage of. Something, again, I have to study more, but where they expected that it was supposed to be someone from the Free State, someone from England, and this third party. But the third party doesn't seem to have been neutral at all. And in the end, the report was basically change almost nothing. In fact, I think some villages in Donegal were supposed to have been given to Northern Ireland, and some other bits of Northern Ireland given over. So the Free State government was kind of embarrassed about it, and even said, "Look, we'll forgive some of your debts. We forget about it." If there hadn't been the Civil War, I don't think that would have even happened. And I think what Collins and others expected over the Boundary Commission would have happened, and maybe the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would have been reduced to 4 counties or 3.5 counties. And I also think that the Free State would have been more interested in what was happening in Northern Ireland, in getting it back, in unification, or developing relations. Whereas what happened was they simply kind of ignored it. De Valera, when he got elected a few times, he talked about it, but he did nothing. I think the first meeting between the Taoiseach of Ireland and the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland was 1966, Lamas and Terence O'Neill, I think. It's as if the Civil War, they didn't want to look backwards anymore or forwards. They just wanted to survive. I think it had that terrible effect on vision. It removed the vision. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. A lot of work. It's a what if, but one that is very, very worth looking at. Okay, unless anybody has any other questions, I'm going to wind up here. Just remind you that the next week I'll be doing a live stream with Mihal from Clans and Dynasties, with Irish Medieval History, and another channel. It'll be on at 10 p.m. We'll be discussing clans in, say, early modern, late medieval Ireland. So it should be a fruitful discussion. God knows, maybe even there might be some arguments. I will be releasing a video about the myth of Irish slavery as well. I've recorded the audio. I'm just wondering how to record the pictures. I might record myself talking. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about it. So that will probably be coming out over the weekend. I'll do a few shorts as well. So I'll finish up there now. I hope you've all enjoyed listening. And if you've any other questions, Kevin, I'll come back to yours. I'll have a look at that. So you can ask me on the channel or ask me anywhere, and I will try and come back. So I don't think I'll do Q&A next week, because I'll be doing another live stream. But in 2 weeks, I definitely will. So I'll say good night to everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Slán, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.